this is Dazatron's Diorama Llama, and welcome to the second part of my how-to video tutorial, and this is how to paint a simple base. So if you haven't already checked out the video how to make the simple base, then do go and look for that on the channel, and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint it so it looks something similar to this one here. Okay, so we've got this kind of rocky formation, and then we've got what's meant to be, I suppose, the kind of the metal part of the Transformers arc. So that's what we're going for. So what you'll need for this is obviously your completed styrofoam base. And again, in my earlier videos I will go through how to shape this and where to get it from, and so on. You'll need some acrylic paints. Acrylics are the best paints to use, I found, for this. I haven't tried out things like enamels. I know you can get spray paint as well, particularly for putting on a base coat, and you're welcome to do that. But I just want to kind of show you something as simple as I possibly can with as little setup as possible, so you can just have a go, as I said, with as little equipment as possible. So with acrylic paint, you don't need to use the expensive sort, which is what I've got here, although this is their lower priced range. This is Dale Roney's graduate acrylic range, but any cheap acrylics would work. So yeah, try places like The Works if you're in the UK, the range, Hobbycraft, yeah, that's another place you could try, and of course any kind of normal arts and craft suppliers will have acrylic paint as well. So we're going to be using black acrylic and also this one here, which is burnt umber. You could use burnt sienna, that would work just as well. Just got a small, more of a reddish tone to it if it's burnt sienna. So those are the two that we're going to use. You will need just an old pot or cup just to put some water in. You'll need some older brushes. It doesn't matter if your brushes are a bit tatty as well for this, because we're only put on the base coat and we're using a technique called dry brush, so it does tend to ruin the brushes anyway. So again, don't use expensive brushes if you are going to any kind of art supply shops. You'll also need something to put your paint onto. Again, don't go out and buy an artist palette, just an old plate would do the trick. And with acrylic paint, because when it goes hard, essentially it dries as a plastic, you can kind of peel this paint off. So there's no even need to kind of wash your plate once you've finished. You need a suitable surface to work on. I just tend to use a bit of old paper as well, just to protect the table or desk that you're working on. So that's the equipment that you'll need to get going. For the first part of this video, I'm just going to do a base coat, and then I will show you then how to kind of add a bit more detail to it a bit later. Just one thing to mention before I start the video: if you followed the last video, you might notice it's slightly different. Not greatly. All I've done is with a file, one of these small files here, I've just worked into this a little bit more. I've pulled out more of the gaps inside, just made those a little bit deeper. I've kind of roughed up the stones a bit more just to give them a bit more texture. And as I said in my last video, it really depends on how much time you want to put into this, as to what kind of finish you will get. But even if you used the finish from the last video, it would still work perfectly fine and look good. I just wanted to add a little bit more detail into this, so I just thought I'd mention that before we begin. Now when you do get, if you're using tube acrylics, you can get them in different sizes. You'll find it's quite thick, so I'm just going to squeeze a little bit. You don't need a lot on there, so you're talking, you know, smaller than a 5p piece. So that kind of size there, and we're going to water that down. So I'm going to use a larger flat brush. I do tend to find that flat brushes work better for these techniques, rather than use a round brush, which you might have available if you have a brush set at all. So if you are going to go out and get some brushes, I think a flat brush works better. This is actually a watercolor brush, but again, you don't need any nice brushes. In fact, cheaper the better sometimes with work like this. So I'm just going to dip my brush into the water, and I'm just going to take a bit from the edge of the black, and then I'm just going to thin that down. So I only want a thin layer because I don't want to end up with lumps on the surface of the base. So that's why we're watering it down rather than using it as it is. And then you simply apply the paint. You just paint it over the top. I want to get into all the kind of the nooks and the crannies, into all these little details. So I'm really pushing the brush into these areas here, just to make sure I've got inside that line there. You could use a smaller brush if you wanted to, but you don't need to. So I'm just going back to my water just to keep this nice and wet. You will find acrylic paint dries quickly. So I've just gone in there with the just into the details, as you can see, just to make that as dark as possible. I'm actually going to use the burnt umber or the burnt sienna on the top for the rest of it. So I'm just going to leave that for a moment now, and I'm just going to work into the rock formation. And notice I'm kind of dabbing into all these kind of like creases and details, because these are the areas that I want to stay dark. I don't want those to be light, so I want it to look like, you know, shadows in there, and this kind of, as you said, you know, these kind of details that we've already added, I want them to kind of stand out. So by making those areas darker, when we add the dry brush technique, it would then start to stand out, because the dry brush technique tends to pick out the raised surfaces. So by having darker paint in the parts that are recessed, again, it gives this impression of kind of a 3D quality. Don't drop your base into your paint like I just did there. So that's looking pretty much there. Just going to do one last check, different angles. So you can see there, I'm giving it a good cover, and I think I've caught all the bits there. So I'm just going to put that on here for a moment, wash my brush. So I'm just dabbing the brush into the water just to kind of loosen any of the paint that might be stuck inside the bristles. And it's a good idea to have something just to wipe off any excess paint. So I've just got a bit of tissue there, but you could use an old rag. That would be perfectly fine. So now I'm going to take some of the burnt umber or burnt sienna, whichever one you've got there. About the same amount again, smaller than a 5p piece. Yeah, so very small amount again. Take some of the water. So I'm just kind of pushing that into the acrylic just to kind of thin that paint out. You will find some of the black is going to show up underneath, and that's absolutely fine. This is just our base coat. So I'm going to hold on to this while it's wet, the bottom. But again, you might want to give it a bit of drying time. This is actually mixing with the black underneath, which is perfectly fine. So when I'm brushing it over the top, I'm not trying to get into the creases. It doesn't matter if it does get into the creases a little bit, but I'm kind of keeping my bristles flat against the top of the surface here. So I'm just going to water that last bit down just to kind of make sure I've covered what I need to. Now you might be able to see there's still parts of grey just on the very edge here, so I'm just going to try and get into those bits as well. Just dab in the top area. And as I've turned it round, I can also see parts of the rock face that I've missed as well. So I'm going to get a bit more black in a moment and just kind of paint it from this angle. So I'm just going to get some of that black. I'm not even going to wash my brush. Just move that over here so you can see what I'm doing. Because as I'm looking at this base from this lower angle, I can see where I've missed a few bits. So I'm just trying to get into all those areas. So really kind of dab it in there, get your brush into all those kind of little holes. And that looks about right. So it doesn't look great at the moment, but as I said, it's just a base coat. So I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll come back to you in a moment and to show you how to add some more colour and kind of really kind of brighten it up and freshen it up a little bit. So you can see there's quite a few paints out on here. I would say you don't need all of these, but it's just to show you what I've used on this piece here. Again, just so you've got an idea. Just trying to see if the light can capture the detail on that a little bit. Okay, so the main colours then for the top, which represents the arc, would be yellow ochre and gold. I tend to use gold because it does give you a slight metallic finish, although it is mixed with regular colours, so it's not kind of full on kind of shiny metallic, but it does still give you a little bit of a, just like a glimmer, or kind of glittery effect to it. So I do tend to use the gold with the ochre. Sometimes I use a bit of yellow just to kind of give it a lift, to make the colour a bit brighter, a bit more orange, and I use cadmium red as well. Can also go back to the brown colour that we used as the base colour, if you wanted to kind of darken any areas up. Again, that's up to you. It's all personal preference really. The main two colours you really need is red and yellow. It's simply to make an orange, so it doesn't have to be primary yellow and cadmium red. Whatever you've got in any sets that you've gone out and brought, or if you've got anything in the house, yeah, red and yellow is essentially what you need to make an orange, so that you can kind of pick that out on the top here. For the rock formation bit, you essentially need grey, which is white and black. You can sometimes just get different types of grey within sets, but essentially white and black is what you need. So you can make different shades of grey, because you will need some lighter shades and darker shades. And I also tend to use a little bit of green. Again, I just think it makes it look like it's kind of aged a bit, it's been there a while. So this is Hooker's green, but it doesn't have to be exactly that shade. I tend to find a darker green works a little bit better than, say, a lime green, which is again quite yellow and quite bright. But again, it's what you've got at hand really. So this is just showing you what I use, but essentially you could go for your own colour scheme. You don't even have to use this kind of orangey shade. You could use more of a blue or purple or silver. It really is up to you. It's your base, it's your design. So yeah, so do what you want to do. And that's the same for the rock formation. You might want to go for like this one here, and that Kingdom Rodimus is standing on, which is more of a brown kind of sandstone, I guess, kind of colour, rather than the grey. So, and again, it's up to you. So have a little play with that. So I'm just going to start with the rock formation, because at least I've got something to hold on to at the bottom, so I find it easier to start with that. You don't want anything too small, so I tend to find something this kind of size here. I mean, that's probably just over a centimetre in thickness, but a slightly bigger brush I find works best. What you don't want is like a household kind of paintbrush, not a large one anyway, because it's going to be too big for what you're doing. So I'm just going to mix a little bit of the white and a tiny touch. I'm just going to take the very corner of the brush, really small amount of black there, because you need very little black to make a difference when you're making grey. So I'm just going to make a tiny amount, add a bit more. So I'm going to start with that, and then what you want to do is actually wipe off that paint. So most of that you want to take off the brush, so there's not actually a lot left on there, and then you're just going to kind of brush over the top. And what will happen is the parts that are raised on the rocks, so these kind of textures, will grab the paint, and it will start to just kind of bring that to life a little bit more. And because as you're kind of moving your brush over that surface, it's also drying out that paint a little bit more. You can kind of press a little bit heavier then and kind of work into there a little bit more. But what you don't want to do is to go into the cracks. You want to leave those. And you can see already it's starting to pick out some of that detail. So you continue to do that around your design. So it makes this lighter grey. Dry that off. And then I'm just going to do the same again. So I'm just going to kind of touch. Now with this second coat, I'm going a little bit lighter, because I'm not trying to go over everything I've just done. I'm trying to capture kind of the edges, if you like. So I'm not going everywhere. I'm just trying to touch the very kind of ends of the rocks. It's just picking out those kind of rocks a little bit more. So what I'm now going to do is add a tiny amount of green. So really small amount. So you can see just a tiny amount there. And I'm just going to mix that into the grey here. Now already that's quite dry, so I'm just going to very lightly brush that over the top. I tend to go near the bottom, and you won't see a lot of difference between it, but I just think it just kind of adds a little bit more. And that's probably enough. And when you see it in the light, which you probably won't show up on camera very well, I just think it adds something else to it. So, but it's up to you. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So then we're going to move on to the top. So I'm going to wash my brush. And I need to make sure this is as dry as I can get it. So really squeeze out the water, because you want to use a similar technique. It doesn't have to be quite as dry for the top, because there's not as much texture, because it's quite flat. So for the most part we're just kind of painting over the top, but again, you don't want your brush too wet. So I've got ochre, it does actually look quite like a gold colour, but it hasn't got any metallic effect to it. I've got the gold here, which looks a lot richer, as you can tell, and then I've got the red there. And I'm just going to move between those colours until I'm happy with the result that I'm getting. So I'm actually going to start with the gold, and I'm just going to brush it on over the top, so I'm not too worried at the moment. So you'll see it's quite strong when you first put it on, because you will build this up in layers. When you get to some of these details here, you're just going to brush over the top. So a bit like that dry brush technique that we just used, because what I don't want to do is to go into the cracks again. I want to just kind of brush over the top. So you don't want it to be too wet. Going in different angles. So it looks very bright. In fact, that gold really does kind of capture the light, doesn't it? So I tend to mix the red on here as I go along. So I'm just going to put a bit of red on there. And because it's wet, you can see it's starting to mix in with the colour that's already there. So we're starting to get some more of that orange kind of tone now. And as I said, you will have to build this up in layers. So I'm just going to add a bit more of the red to this side. Don't worry if you end up, when you put the red on, if it's too strong, because you can just go back to your yellow ochre and you can just kind of lighten that up on top. Now I don't mind there being some little blemishes, some of the burnt sienna coming through. I just think that adds a bit of character to it, but you might want a smoother coat. You might want it more orange or more gold. It really is, again, up to you, your personal preference. And then for the edge, it's the same process. So you just continue to mix between those colours. Try and paint away from the rocks. So kind of just get that into position. So I'm just kind of going to the edges. Try not to touch the rock because obviously that will ruin the illusion. And again, because there's a bit of detail there, I'm just kind of dry brushing over the top. And I'm going to use a little bit of red, and then again, just to tone that down. A little bit too much there, but I can go over the top again. So maybe use a bit of gold, lighten that up. Just hold that up to you. You can kind of see. And if you have a look at the rocks as well. Yeah, and that is pretty much it. And then of course you can put your figure on top of that. So if I just grab pop figure, because that's what's at hand, and of course you've got your base with your figure. Over into transformer. There we go. Let's just make him stand up a little bit better. There we go. Let's try that. And there is your stand for your transformer figures. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. I'll be back to you soon with another how-to video.